Well, hello, and welcome to Black Hammer Artisan. Today, I'm going to show you how to make a railroad spike into a throwing axe. So the basic processes I'm going to be doing, transforming this into this, is going to be, of course, this will get flattened out into a beard. That's what this is called, the beard of the axe. I'm going to do it a little bit longer. This one turned out, it's pretty good, but it turned out a little bit more bulbous on the front and not quite as long as I'd like it to be. So I'm going to lengthen that a little bit. I'm going to punch a hole naturally for the eye, which is what the handle goes through. And then I will also taper this down to a spike like this, so it makes a more effective weapon. Real quick, I wanted to remind you to subscribe to the channel, just because I know a lot of people will forget to do that. So like the video, like it, subscribe to the channel. The only tools that are not necessarily in just like basic blacksmithing tools are going to be a drift, and that's what you push that through the piece of material to make the eye the right shape. And this is a hot cut chisel, and you really should have one of these in your kit anyway, but it's just a piece of bar that I've tapered down on one side to a chisel. Pretty self-explanatory. You could definitely make this yourself. Going to be making this in the charcoal forge. So currently I don't have my bellows system optimized, so I'm just doing this by hand, but there will be an axle system that will just be lever actuated and will pump these for me in the near future. So as you can see here, I kind of have a little jerry-rigged, this is just a shovel head across the back, which is held down by some bricks and propped up by a stick. And the reason I have that is because oftentimes these forges either would have actually been built either on the ground or on a table with a lot of room around them that was either bricks or clay or something like that. This one is just on a narrow table, so I'm going to extend out the table, but right now this charcoal tends to roll off onto the ground and just waste itself, so that's why that's there if you're wondering. So as you can see over there, the fire is burning very, very well, getting nice and hot. Should be about ready to pull out anytime now. So I'm drawing out the bit here, as you can see. As usual, once it gets down to a mid to low red heat, put it back in the forge. So the hot spot in the forge is going to be right in front of where the air comes in. That's where you're going to want to put it. Make sure you put it there. Okay, it's about thinned down enough. I'm going to just straighten that out a little bit, like that. And then I think now I'm going to take my bigger hammer. Well, you could do this with a regular hammer. And as I said, draw it out. All right, that's getting pretty cold there, so we'll stick that back in the forge. Good. One thing I would like to mention is don't spend the majority of your time when you're using the hammer up here, because what that does is it shortens the amount of wood that's between you and the hammerhead, so that when you hit, more shock goes into your hand and into your wrist. So it's better to hit from back here most of the time. If you're gonna do some real fine blows, gives you a little more control, so you can go ahead and grab up here. But just be careful, because if you shock your wrist too much, you can get tendonitis, and it's definitely not something you want. As you will already know, if you've watched my forge video, where I go over how I built this forge and basically how it works, you don't want to force too much air in. So when I first started out, I was kind of pumping more vigorously like that. I think it's actually, I'm getting better heats, but just take it a little gentler, because that way the air doesn't rush through, because the charcoal can only take so much air. And so if you put more than that amount of air in there, what happens is excess air is rushing through your charcoal and actually cooling down your metal. So now we're heating up the spike section of it, and one thing to remember when you're heating up cold metal, the first heat, just getting it initially hot, is always the slowest by far, the slowest heat. Just gonna mark the hole with a relatively low heat. I'm gonna establish that a little more. So again, just taking my time, marking out the bottom so that it all lines up good. Makes a good eye when we're finished. But I'm going to put that back in the fire now. Putting it over the hardy hole here, so when that slug comes out of there, it doesn't just hit in the face of the anvil, it goes down. Also, I should have worn gloves. Remember to wear gloves when you do this, because you're putting your hand closer to the piece, and that's making my hand rather uncomfortably warm. Alright, now I'm going to come over to the vise. One of the things when you're using the vise, you're going to have to get above it like this. So I'm standing on a stump here so I can get appropriately above it, because if you're swinging like this, you're gonna have a lot of power. But on the other hand, it's really handy to have it higher for some projects. So I would recommend not lowering your vise unless you have multiple vices. Then it can be nice to have a low one. So as you can see here, we're just about done. I'll take this over to the edge so I don't hit the face of my anvil. So I like to keep it clean without denting it. It's one thing you learn around the blacksmithing community: anvils, they're important. We care a lot about them, maybe sometimes too much. As you draw down material, it will develop oftentimes. I don't know if you can see that there. Hopefully you can. A little bit of what's called a fish mouth. That's where the top and the bottom material will kind of move over like that on both sides, and the middle won't move. So you'll kind of have like these two hills moving it up on either side. So that's what I'm doing. I'm straightening it out here with the peen of the hammer. And I will finish this on a file. Sharpen it on a file, that is. We finished it up pretty much. Just about all the forging is done. I might bring this edge down to a little bit more of a tapered, straighten things up just a little bit, but it's pretty much done there. And we're going to move on to the handling now and come back to this later. So for the handle, I'm going to be modeling it off this one. It's going to be slightly different. There's a few things that I would like to do a little bit better. I'm going to be making out of this vine maple. Cut this locally. So we have that, but you should do some research on whatever's in your area, wherever you live, right there, and figure out what sort of wood is good for handles in your area. Because you can get it locally, pretty much always better in case, you know, the world falls apart or something. It's also cheaper. Alright, so this is what our billet's looking like. And one thing, if you have a draw knife, this is where this comes in handy. You can lock it in the vise and just draw knife it if you know what that is. If you don't, it's okay. I'll be making one in a later video at some point. Right now I actually don't have one, so I'm just gonna use an axe, which is a legitimate tool. I mean, it works just fine. I would use it anyway, but particularly for a certain stage that will be coming up soon, I would use a draw knife, and I don't have one. But if you have one, use it. Also, if you have a carving axe, that's a really good tool for any sort of woodworking, which as a blacksmith, you will almost certainly wind up doing some amount of woodworking. I will probably at some point be coming out with these in the store, but right now, this is just the only one I have. It's important to make sure that your handle is straight, so just take care when you're making it to make sure that everything stays straight. Just look at it, kind of look down at it every little bit, and you'll be able to see if there's any warps or bends or anything like that. So I'm just taking this down roughly to the shape of my axe eye. I'm actually going to use a rasp, but you could also use a knife or whatever you want to get it just right. Alright, so this is getting close enough now. I'm gonna take it over to the swage block, which you could also use the jaws of your vise or just about like anything. I'm just gonna kind of give it a couple taps, try and push it in a little bit. That'll give me a little bit closer idea. Starting to look like something. You can kind of see now that I've taken it off, the places that need more removed are very clear. So I'm just gonna saw this to just before where I want the bottom of the axe to sit. We don't want the crack to go quite all the way down that far, or the slit, that is. About that far. I'm just gonna remove some of the burrs here with the rasp. Kind of get raised up when you put it on there. But we don't want to take much off here, because we want to have a pretty good fit. You don't have to go overboard, which I did some of my earlier axes, and it doesn't hurt anything. It's a lot more work, but you do want it to be good and solid once you put the wedge in. Just taking off the corners to begin with, start rounding it down to the right shape. You're going to want to, once it's a little more refined, just kind of pick it up every little while and make sure it feels good in your hand. If it doesn't, adjust it until it does. Just rasping it down to closer dimensions. I'm also taking care to take any axe marks out of it. I'm using the coarse side of the rasp to begin with, then I'll flip to the fine side to kind of, you know, make it finer. So here's what I've done so far, looking pretty good. I'm gonna make this area a little bit thinner just because my hands are pretty big, but anyone else that uses this, this might be a little bit beefy of a handle for them, so I'm gonna thin it down a little bit more with the rasp, and then we'll be pretty much done. Just taking off the corners here on the bottom because I think it looks nicer. If you're familiar with woodworking, you're gonna be familiar with the scraper, or if you do any sort of bushcraft or that sort of thing, you're probably gonna be more familiar with the 90-degree angle on the back of a knife, which is what is historically often used. It works very well, so that's what I'm using to smooth this up, because well, the rasp leaves it kind of rough, so that's why I'm doing this, if you're wondering. It works very well. One thing, if you do use a vise, I'm using an old leather glove here, or a piece of leather or something, to make sure that once you get it nice and fine, you don't leave marks from your vise, because you clamp it in there real tight and you will leave marks on your piece. Just a little tip. So here's the handle after only scraping. There has been no sanding or anything done to this handle. So the next step is going to be heat treating the blade. I'm not going to go over that in this video just because it's getting a bit long. Heat treating is important because the blade right now is quite soft, and if you try to use it as it is, it wouldn't hold an edge very well. So you'd constantly be resharpening it, and you'd be blunting it all the time, and you know, just not things you want. So heat treating is the process of hardening and then tempering essentially, so that it's hard enough and not too hard. But that's the next step I'm gonna be working on here. So what I'm gonna do here in just a second is I'm gonna pull that axe out of the forge and I'm gonna quench it in this water. Normally, and any of you experienced smiths who may be watching this, but may not be familiar with railroad spikes, normally I wouldn't quench in water. It hardens a little bit too aggressively for most high carbon steels, and you can easily crack a piece of steel by hardening in water. But in this case, railroad spike, they say they're high carbon, they're really more mid carbon, low end spectrum of high carbon steel. So I'm not too worried about it cracking. I'm going to quench it in water in that quench tank right there in just a second. Also, I'm going to be going over this in another video, the whole heat treating process, but it's up to critical temperature right now, which is a little over 1600 degrees or something like that, which is where it becomes non-magnetic. That's how you can tell when it's at the right temperature. So I'm going to go right now. You want to move it around. The body of the axe didn't get hardened there. I'm just quenching it so it'll be easier to handle. Probably going to be still warm. Oh, nope, that's fully cooled. So I'm going to do the file test. Right, so it skates a file, not completely, like the file does bite just a little bit. But not much, certainly not as much as it does like back here. Up here, yeah, doesn't bite very well, so we can tell if that's hardened. So we got a hardened axe. I'm just tempering it. And what that means is heating it, because when you harden it, it gets a little bit too hard. It gets kind of brittle, and that means you can fairly easily break it. So I'm just tempering it so I can see. Usually I'll wait till I can see a bronze color, because first the colors I think will be light blue, then a darker blue, and then it'll kind of fade into a bronze, then a dark brown. I'm just going to take this to a light blue, and the reason is because, again, as I mentioned, this is not an extremely hard steel. So just a very light temper will be enough with this. So we're just going to assemble it now. I'm not going to use glue, but that is actually a good idea if you want to. There's that. I'm going to take it over to the swage block now and knock it in properly. That looks about good. Be careful. I accidentally just broke off this side here, trying to open it up with the punch. Try not to do that if you can help it. Right, so sorry I couldn't catch it on camera, but I snapped a couple handles, 2 of them, trying to put into this. And I found out the reason why was because the eye of the axe wasn't big enough. So when you make it, make sure you make the eye more like this size or this size, because as I had to do, I had to heat it back up, widen the eye by chiseling it in a groove and then widening that over the horn instead of with my drift. And that meant that I ruined the heat treat. So I had to reheat treat the whole thing. And yeah. So you want your eye, at least what works for me, is having your eye probably 1.5 inches long or so by probably 1 inch wide, as opposed to mine was a good deal smaller than that before, so that's what it is now. The other thing is, the reason why my handles were snapping specifically was I would saw the groove down into them, and then when I went to put the wedge in, there wasn't enough material on each side of that wedge, so the wedge just pushed it out over the edge of the eye here, and just snapped them. So you definitely want to make sure that you have enough material in there, which is why you need a big enough eye. When you put your wedge in, it doesn't snap it. Basically, you just make a wedge by rasping down, or at least how I usually do it, rasping down a thin piece of wood on both sides to an even taper, which you then wedge into or drive into the groove that you cut with the saw. Other thing you might be wondering about is, if you can see, there's a little metal wedge in here. It's called the keeper wedge. That's just to make sure that this wooden wedge doesn't come out at some point. Also, you want to make sure that you have enough stock above your eye here, because these one downside to making this out of a railroad spike, there's not a lot of thickness here. So when you make this, the eye will be reasonably thin. So you want to have material coming up over the edge or over the top, a bit of it, as you can see on this here. That's a pretty good design there. One of you amazing viewers out there commented asking me how I built the shelter that I'm smithing underneath. So I just wanted to answer that question real quick. And if you have any more questions, drop in the comment section, just a quick reminder. But basically I have 4 trees I'm using as corner posts. I then have some diagonal beams going from the higher ones to the lower ones. And then I have some rafters going in between those, and basically just a big pile of tree branches on top of that. And so far it seems to be keeping out the rain well enough. Still a work in progress. I'll probably do a video testing these things at some point, just a whole video, take them out and see what we can do with them. So I hope you found this video helpful for making your own medieval throwing axes. Stay tuned for more coming from the forge, and until next time, farewell, wherever you fare.